Star Wars. The film that invented the modern blockbuster nearly died in a Tunisian rainstorm, in an editing room, and in a hospital bed, all before anyone had seen a single frame. Principal photography began in the Tunisian desert on March 22, 1976, and it fell apart almost immediately. On the very first day, the droid R2-D2 refused to work because its batteries were dead. The other remote-controlled droids were worse. Some fell over, some never moved at all, and some had their control signals scrambled by Arabic language radio broadcasts, which sent them careening off across the sand out of anyone's control. The R2 unit picked up Tunisian radio so easily that the crew eventually gave up and dragged it along the desert floor on hidden skis pulled by a wire. Then the weather turned. During the first week of shooting, it rained in the Nefta Valley for the first time in 7 years, and it didn't stop for 4 days. Equipment and vehicles bogged down in the mud, and the Tunisian army had to be called in to pull them out. A sandstorm tore through the set and destroyed the Jawas sandcrawler, which the crew rebuilt in a single day. That same sandcrawler reportedly almost started a war when the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi mistook it for a real military vehicle and accused Tunisia of staging an invasion. And the disasters followed George Lucas home. During post-production, he checked into a hospital with chest pains, convinced he was having a heart attack, only to be told it was hypertension, exhaustion, and an anxiety attack. When he got back, he discovered his effects team at Industrial Light and Magic had completed only a handful of the roughly 365 effects shots the film needed, while burning through more than half of its $2 million budget. Against his doctor's advice, he fired his original editor and rebuilt the entire cut with a new team that included his then-wife, Marcia Lucas. The movie that rewrote the economics of Hollywood was, at the time, a runaway its own creator thought might never work. Back to the Future. For roughly 5 weeks, Marty McFly was played by a completely different actor, and almost every frame he shot ended up in the trash. Eric Stoltz was originally cast as Marty and filmed the role for somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks before he was let go. Director Robert Zemeckis and co-writer Bob Gale had actually wanted Michael J. Fox from the very beginning, but Fox's schedule on the sitcom Family Ties made him unavailable, and a Universal executive named Sid Sheinberg pushed for Stoltz instead. Once filming started, Zemeckis and Gale realized Stoltz was playing the part far too seriously, missing the comedy the whole film was built on. Making the switch was brutally expensive. The recast reportedly cost the production between $3.5 and $4 million, including paying Stoltz his full salary, and it wiped out around 34 days of schedule. Fox had to shoot around his day job, filming the sitcom during the day and the movie at night. And somehow, it worked. Scenes that had taken about 4 weeks to shoot with Stoltz were reportedly redone with Fox in roughly 73 hours. One of the most beloved time travel films ever made almost shipped with the wrong lead, and fixing that mistake became one of the most expensive casting changes in Hollywood history. Blade Runner. The film, now hailed as a masterpiece, was taken away from its director, re-edited by its producers, and saddled with a narration its own star seemed to hate. When Ridley Scott cast Harrison Ford, the movie's financiers reportedly asked who on earth Harrison Ford even was, despite the fact that he had already played Han Solo. Scott's perfectionism ran the shoot 2 weeks behind schedule after just 3 weeks of filming, which made the financiers behind the completion guarantee extremely nervous. Ford later described the experience bluntly, calling the shoot a nightmare, while the crew worked night after night soaked to the bone as Scott obsessed over the look of every single shot. When Scott finally delivered his first cut, it ran close to 4 hours. The producers, dismayed, took the film out of his hands and re-edited it themselves. They added the now infamous voiceover narration from Ford's character to help audiences follow what was happening. Ford has always denied deliberately reading that narration badly, blaming the flat delivery on a lack of any creative input. All of that studio meddling is the reason at least 7 different versions of the film have been shown to audiences over the years. The definitive cyberpunk movie only became definitive after decades of recuts slowly undid the damage. Alien 3. David Fincher started shooting one of the biggest science fiction sequels of its era without a finished script, and it nearly ended his film career before it even began. Fincher took over the project late, after director Renny Harlin departed, leaving him only about 5 weeks of prep time. Production began without a completed screenplay because the story had already been through so many rewrites that nobody could ever get it right. By some counts, roughly 10 different writers worked on the film across its development. About $7 million had already been spent on sets that were never even used, all because the script kept changing before filming had properly started. The studio called the on-set script doctor almost daily with new demands, and fresh pages were being faxed in nearly every day during the shoot. Representatives from Fox literally shadowed Fincher on set to make sure the studio's orders were carried out. Eventually he walked, after the studio rejected his cut and ordered extensive reshoots, and to this day he has disowned the finished film, saying he would never again start something without a script he actually believed in. By the way, if you're enjoying this one so far, I make videos like this all the time, and a subscribe would genuinely help the channel out. Thanks. Waterworld. The most expensive movie ever made at the time literally sank into a Hawaiian harbor while a second unit was still filming on it. For the production, the crew built an enormous floating set, an artificial atoll, in Kauai Harbor off the Big Island of Hawaii. It cost around $22 million on its own and weighed more than 1,000 tons. Then a storm rolled in and sank the entire slave colony set about 100 feet down into the harbor, while stunt performers were still being filmed on it by a second unit. The crew had to build a replacement from scratch, and that was only the beginning. The original budget had been about $100 million across 96 shooting days, already enormous because of how complicated the water sets were. The schedule never accounted for the ocean itself. There were constant weather delays, and at one point a tsunami scare halted production for half a day. The crew battled relentless seasickness, including the director Kevin Reynolds, and everyone had to be ferried back and forth to the floating sets. By the time it was finished, the film had cost roughly $175 million, making it the most expensive movie ever made up to that point, a record it held only until Titanic came along. And here's the twist nobody remembers. Despite being mocked as one of the great flops, it grossed around $264 million worldwide, and, thanks to overseas ticket sales and home releases, actually turned a profit in the end. Event Horizon. The scariest version of this haunted spaceship film exists only in rumor, because the studio made the director cut half an hour out of it and then destroyed the footage. Paramount rushed both filming and editing when the shifting release date of Titanic scrambled the schedule. Director Paul W. S. Anderson saw his post-production window slashed from an initial 6 weeks down to 4, far below the 10 weeks directors are usually given. Test audiences recoiled at the gore, so Paramount forced Anderson to strip about 30 minutes of the grimmest material out of his roughly 130-minute cut, leaving the 96-minute film we know. Paramount later junked the deleted footage entirely, and no complete director's cut has ever surfaced. The studio didn't just cut the film, they erased it. The Abyss. James Cameron flooded an unfinished nuclear reactor with millions of gallons of water and very nearly drowned 2 of his stars and himself in the process. To get the underwater scale he wanted, Cameron shot inside an abandoned, never-completed nuclear power plant in South Carolina, using a reactor containment vessel that held over 7.5 million gallons of water and took 5 full days to fill. During one underwater sequence, Ed Harris nearly drowned. His air ran out, his safety diver got tangled on a cable and couldn't reach him, and another crew member handed him a breathing regulator upside down, which fed him water instead of air. It was the underwater cinematographer, Al Giddings, who finally ripped it free and gave Harris his own regulator. When Harris surfaced, he reportedly punched Cameron, and later that night he had to pull his car over because he broke down crying. He has refused to talk about the film ever since. Cameron nearly drowned too, descending into a deep tank without safety divers, punching a diver, and swimming for the surface when his own regulator failed. A film about the deep sea very nearly killed the people making it, and the star's decades of silence tell you just how bad it got. The motion picture. Star Trek's very first movie was still missing most of its visual effects just months before a release date the studio simply couldn't move. Paramount fired the effects house Robert Abel and Associates on February 22, 1979, after roughly a year of work and $5 million had produced only a single usable shot. Douglas Trumbull was brought in to rescue it, and he had to deliver dozens of effects shots in about 6 months, by his own estimate more than Star Wars and Close Encounters combined. Locked into a December 1979 release the studio was financially committed to, Paramount handed Trumbull what he later described as an almost unlimited budget just to finish on time. The film made its date, but it effectively went out with the ink still wet. World War Z. This zombie blockbuster had its entire ending scrapped and rewritten after the movie was supposedly already finished, and its prop guns triggered a real counterterrorism raid. In June of 2012, the studio pushed the release back and hired Damon Lindelof to rewrite the third act. Short on time, he handed the job off to Drew Goddard to finish. The crew then returned to Budapest for about 7 weeks of additional shooting that autumn, which ballooned the budget to a reported $190 million, with some accounts putting it far higher. The original third act that got thrown out included a massive zombie battle in Moscow's Red Square, with about 12 minutes of footage, all of it dropped from the final cut. And the strangest disaster happened earlier. Hungary's counterterrorism unit raided a Budapest warehouse and seized 85 assault rifles, sniper rifles, and handguns that had been flown in to use as props. The paperwork claimed the weapons had been disabled. Every single one of them turned out to be fully functional. A finished movie was rebuilt from the second half outward, and the production's own props became a national security incident. Dune. David Lynch made a science fiction epic so compromised that he eventually took his own name off it. The roughly 6-month shoot was staggering in scale, using 80 separate sets across 16 sound stages, a crew of 1,700 people, and more than 20,000 extras. But producer Dino De Laurentiis pressured Lynch to cram Frank Herbert's sprawling novel into a single film and to cut costs wherever possible, even forcing Lynch to share his Mexico City locations and crew with another De Laurentiis production, Conan the Destroyer. Lynch never had final cut. The film grossed only about $31 million against a budget of $40 to $42 million. Lynch disowned the longer television version so completely that it credits the fake name Alan Smithy instead of his own. A visionary director's passion project was ground down until he refused to sign it. Jurassic Park. On the final day of location shooting, a Category 4 hurricane flattened the island and destroyed much of the set. Hurricane Iniki struck the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11, 1992, which happened to be the last scheduled day of filming on location. With winds around 145 miles per hour, the cast and crew sheltered in place while the storm tore apart much of the multi-million-dollar set. Rather than simply accept the loss, Steven Spielberg sent people back out to film the real wind and rain, and some of that genuine storm footage ended up in the movie's own storm sequence. Iniki was no mere inconvenience. It caused over $3 billion in damage, and took the lives of 6 people on Kauai. One of the most successful films ever made nearly ended in a natural disaster, and its director turned the very storm that wrecked his set into a scene. Dr. Moreau. This adaptation burned through its original director in the first few days, and then collapsed into what many people still call the most chaotic science fiction shoot ever filmed. Director Richard Stanley had developed the project for years as a personal passion, only to be fired by New Line Cinema within days of shooting beginning, reportedly by fax. The studio blamed him for falling behind and for being unable to control his star, Val Kilmer. Veteran director John Frankenheimer was rushed in barely half a week into production to take over. From there, it only got stranger. Marlon Brando, cast as Moreau, largely withdrew from the production after the death of his daughter, leaving his expanded role hanging in limbo. Kilmer, who had reportedly been served divorce papers on set, clashed with much of the cast. The shoot itself was battered by harsh weather, including a hurricane, and by a budget that kept climbing. And then there's the detail nobody believes at first. After his firing, Richard Stanley, who was legally barred from the set, reportedly snuck back on, disguised in one of the film's own Dogman creature costumes, just to watch his project fall apart from the inside. The finished movie was a critical and commercial disaster, and the whole saga later became the subject of a documentary called Lost Soul. Almost every category of production nightmare, a fired director, a checked-out legend, a warring star, a hurricane, and a runaway budget, happened on this one film. Rogue One. The first standalone Star Wars film was rebuilt so heavily in reshoots that a second writer earned a co-writing credit, and every main character's fate changed. In June of 2016, Lucasfilm brought in Tony Gilroy to rework the movie after the studio was unhappy with director Gareth Edwards' version. By August, Gilroy was overseeing reshoots that reworked the ending and changed enough of the story that he earned a co-screenwriting credit. He restructured much of the third act, and the version audiences finally saw ends with all of the main characters dying. An earlier draft had given Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso a much more openly romantic relationship, including a kiss just before their deaths, which Gilroy softened into something more ambiguous. Edwards has said he stayed involved throughout the roughly 5 weeks of reshoots, including the celebrated final Darth Vader hallway scene. In 2023, he even pushed back on reports that he had been sidelined, insisting he and Gilroy worked closely the whole time. Just how much really changed is still debated, with Edwards downplaying it and other reports calling the overhaul extensive. But here's the thing, a modern film that everyone actually saw was quietly rebuilt after it was supposedly done, and some of its most iconic moments came straight out of those emergency reshoots. If you made it this far and enjoyed the ride, consider subscribing so you don't miss whatever we dig into next. Thanks for watching.